Hi everyone, my name is Keely Ray Barrick and I'm going to be reflecting on and highlighting a few artifacts that describe both myself and my roles as a language user, language learner, language analyst, and language advocate. I'd like to start out by examining my role as a language user. As someone who almost exclusively uses English and is fundamentally monolingual, I had a hard time figuring out how to break down my language repertoire. However, after thinking about my typical day, I thought about all the language within language that I use. In my language portrait, I chose to put the yellow, representing English, over the majority of my head. This was to represent how I think, talk, hear, and understand standard English the best and most often. The blue is used to represent the interpretation and importance of understanding body language both in my job and social settings. I colored the feet green to represent the Spanish I know, which is pretty limited to the basic concepts such as where are you going and where are you from. The pink on my hands is to represent the texting and virtual language so many of us have come to learn and understand. Finally, the black stripes represent the ability to read and understand music, as I spent almost all my school years in the school band. Although most of these are very broad and cover only part of my language repertoire, I think they really highlight how much diversity there is in one language, let alone all the diversity that comes in knowing and mixing many languages together like many students are able to do. It is also important in my discussion as a language user to talk about with whom and when I use a certain type of language. Although I'm not going to go over all the types of language outlined in my language map, just merely looking at it shows how being with certain people influence your language usage. On top of using it with different people, language can change within the same relationship depending on the context. For example, some of my best friends are also my coworkers. At work in front of customers, we have a pretty professional-looking relationship and use standard formal English. In the back room, we use a more relaxed, friendly language as we're still around my bosses. However, outside of work, we talk extremely casually and use slang terms as well as other words I probably shouldn't be using. What makes understanding yourself as a language user so important is that understanding of language in different contexts. Talking with students about how language fits into different contexts is so important, whether it be highlighting different subjects or formal and informal conversations. Teaching students and helping them outline their own language usage can help them make distinctions between these contexts. This can also help them visually see how different language usage leads to different purposes. While doing this, however, it is important to highlight that one type of language is not better than another. It is simply different. All of us have been examining our role as language learners these past few weeks. Although I went through school learning Spanish, my experience learning Italian has been completely different. In school, learning Spanish seemed to be like many of my other classes, memorizing information and spewing it out on tests. Learning a language outside the classroom has proven to be a bit more difficult, as the activities and learning is not outlined for me. I found my time on Duolingo and going to Italian places. I know the most Italian right after practicing it. The longer I keep the learning or discussion going, the more comfortable I feel and the more I retain. Once I jump back into my typical English lifestyle, however, I cannot just pick up where I left off. I have to relearn concepts over and over again. Although I cannot speak for emergent bilinguals, I imagine they face a similar obstacle for those students whose families speak another language at home. Same goes for students who are isolated in their language. I find it much easier to learn a language when talking to someone else in that language than writing out practice sentences and listening to Duolingo. Although I've only been learning this new language for about 15 hours, I face a lot of hesitation and embarrassment of speaking and interacting in that language. I could see how students learning English in the classroom may be weary to participate or feel uncomfortable in their skills. I think what this has shown me the most is the importance of creating a safe space and welcoming mistakes and mispronunciations. Learning through mistakes can be very, very beneficial, and I usually remember the words I get wrong, rather than the ones I continually get right. As I think through my role as a language analyst, it is easiest for me to think about it from the basic level to the more widespread societal level. In class, we compare languages at the phonetic level. Within these comparisons, we saw that not every language shares a set chart of sounds. I think this shows a great example of ways we can support multilingual learners. By understanding a student's native language and the sounds it produces, we can spend more time comparing the differences in sounds between the languages and then move on to pronunciations of new sounds. We can also use this as an insight into why the student is avoiding or having trouble with certain words. Our mouths and throat are muscles, so being aware and patient while the students train their new muscles is key in the development of our language. Moving on to the next level, it is important that we are careful and mindful of the vocabulary used in the classroom and how we promote that vocabulary. Mohi touched on the idea of disciplinary literacy and how learning vocabulary and technical language is not useful unless the student is engaged and able to see the greater context. Many argue that there is nothing to language without context, and teaching technical words and ideas without explaining the concepts is not helping multilingual learners attain proficient literacy. Although this ties in with being a language user, it is important that educators break down the meaning behind these words and ideas. Framing good syntax and vocab by restating the answer is a great tool to get that supplementary language. Instruction should be built around the understanding of a concept rather than the vocabulary, as this will come in time. As we break down these differences in language, it is important to find ways to incorporate the different views and challenge the norms in the classroom, whether that be through different language dialects or different language patterns. Of all these roles, being an advocate holds so much importance. In our action plans, we examined how to create effective educational opportunities for multilingual students and ways of supporting them in the classroom. Although I'm not going to go through my entire action plan, I will highlight some of the central points about being an advocate. 1. It is important to acknowledge that knowledge and language can be valued very differently in different cultures, and it is important to recognize these differences to support those students. If we devalue certain students by the way they use language, we tell them that the way they speak is more important than what they have to say, which will usually cause them to shut down and stop thinking of new ideas. 2. It is important to be adaptive. What works for one student will not work for another, and it is important as educators that we fight for equity in the classroom and the ability for all students to access the materials they need to learn. And finally, 3, creating a safe and open space that explores various identities and cultures. By creating a safe community, one can be open about their identity and build up an understanding of one another. This could be by creating these artifacts outlined in this video, or by going into the community exploring the diversity around the school. Either way, it is important that the students gain that insight and exposure so that they can find where their language and identity are an asset in the classroom.